Good morning. We look today at 2 Kings 13 through 14, and in chapter 13 talks about the reigns of Jehoahaz and Jehoash of Israel, the death of Elisha, and I think that's an interesting as well with various rulers of Israel and Judah that get talked about here, and it's, of course, most of them aren't faithful to God. But it starts, in the 23rd year of King Joash, who was also known as Jehoash. Then Ahaziah, and all of these names that I just don't try to keep track of. I just have struggle with that. But one thing I guess I'd like to visit a little bit about is with the death of Elijah, starting in verse 14. It says he had fallen sick with the illness that he would die from. And King Joash, or Jehoash, which he's known as both names, went down to see the prophet because he had a good relationship with the prophet and trusted the words of the prophet. And he called him my father. I mean, that was the respect that the king had for Elisha, the prophet. And he says, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And I suppose I should have done some research, but I really don't know what that means other than the relationship of Elisha seeing and being separated from Elijah by the chariots, the flaming chariots and the flaming horses as Elijah was raised up into heaven. But the final thing that Elisha, the prophet, says to the king is to take a bow and arrow and shoot one arrow out. And he does that. He opened the window eastward and he shot it. And then, this is the Lord's arrow of victory. And he says, bang on the floor, and he take the arrows, strike the ground with them, and he struck the ground 3 times and stopped. And then Elisha says, you will have 3 victories. If you would have struck 5 or 6 times, you would have struck down Aram until it would have been the end of it. But now it'll just be, you'll have 3 victories. And it's one of those interesting things that, when he does 3, I mean, if he'd have just, you start, if I'd have been there, you feel a little bit, guilty or, pound too much, you don't want to overdo it, so you just do some. But here it would have been better had he pounded the ground more times with the arrows. And then Elisha dies and they bury him. And then there's the next paragraph is, the bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And this was, and we read earlier where it said in the springtime of the year when the kings go to war. It was just kind of, it was like they were tired of sitting home all winter long. It just doesn't make sense to me that they would go to war. But the Moabites would start invading the land in the spring. And this one man, as he was being buried, in the same tomb where Elisha had been buried. And his body touches the bones of Elisha and he comes back to life. I mean, so think about the power that was of God that was in Elisha. It just seems unreal to me that this could happen. But, we have it written in our Bible and it's got to have, some validity to it. But it just, this dead man's body touches Elisha's bones and he comes to life and he stands on his feet again. And it's just, God works in such ways. It's just, amazing. And then this chapter ends with, King Hazael of Aram oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoash. There was just, there was never peace. It was just a continual battle, back and forth and back and forth. And I think of, Israel today. I mean, Israel isn't a peaceful community. There's always contentions and strife going on there. And it's, for God's chosen people and God's chosen land, it's heartbreaking to see so much of that. And in verse 24, when King Hazael of Aram died, his son Ben-Hadad succeeded him. And this is, according to what I can figure out, either the 3rd or 4th different person with this name that has succeeded as king. You know, it isn't, you know, we're not going back in time again, but this is, you know, a third or a fourth one by this name. And then, of course, I mean, then Jehoash, I mean, now it refers to him as Jehoash rather than just Joash again. But it's, I'm pretty sure, the same guy, you know. So then Joash, who was the king, you know, took again the land, you know, some of the cities that had been taken. You know, he recovered some of the property, you know, in another battle that was going on. And then now we're in, it says, in the second year of King Joash, you know, and again, I go back to Joash. I mean, I struggle with keeping track of everything. But he says he was 25 years old when he began to reign. King Amaziah, the son of Joash of Judah, began to reign. So, I mean, you know, as a father and son-in-law or brothers-in-law, I mean, they were related to each other. Anyway, this person did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not quite like his ancestor David, but he followed the ways of God. And the people continued, it says, to make their sacrifices and offerings on the high places. And as was written in the laws, I mean, you know, as soon as the royal power was firmly in his hand, he killed the servants of the ones who had murdered his father, you know, but he didn't put to death the children, because it's, you know, you don't put someone else to death. You don't put the punishment of the dad upon the child or the parent upon, you know, it's just, you know, that doesn't carry through that way. And parents shall not be put to death for the children, nor the children be put to death for the parents, but all shall be put to death for their own sins, is the quote from the law of Moses, and that quote is in verse 6 there. And then it says he killed this 10,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt, and he took Selah by storm. The Valley of Salt is a valley most likely on the south end of the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is, you know, salty. I mean, it's, you know, it's a dead water. It's not productive. It's not a proficient for anything, you know. And so it would make sense that there would be a lot of salt in the soils in that area as well. And then verse 8, Amaziah sends messengers to King Jehoash, saying, "Come, let us look one another in the face. Let's have a war. Let's battle," you know. And the response is a thorn bush of Lebanon. It doesn't fear the cedar. You know, this Jehoash is saying, you know, I'm the cedar. I'm a mighty warrior. I've got much more going for me than you, who are just a little thorn bush. You come up against me, you're going to be stomped, you know. And he says, let's just live in peace. But nope, that's, you know, can't do that. Amaziah would not listen. So they went up and they faced each other in battles. And of course, Jehoash was successful against Amaziah in those battles. And, you know, they continued to have the battles and to have the wars, and different people come in and rule. And again, it's just, you know, King Amaziah, the son of Joash. I mean, I just don't understand. My head just doesn't compute all these names and people. But, you know, in the 15th year of this and that and everything else, you know, too many things going on. But verse 26, the Lord saw the distress for Israel was very bitter. There was no one left bond or free, and no one to help Israel. But the Lord had not said he would blot out the name of Israel. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Joash. So this son of Jeroboam came, and he was, you know, faithful and did what was right for a while anyway. They did what was right in the eyes of God. And then we end this chapter again with Jeroboam slept, you know, he died. And I mean, I guess I've said it before, I'll say it again, that, you know, the history, while it's interesting and it's meaningful, is just hard for me to keep complete track of all of the names and all of the dates, and we're not really given so much dates as to, you know, like which century BC these things were. I'm sure that we can find out if we really wanted to, but the history of Israel is, I don't know, it's up and down. It's so back and forth. Israel and Judah fighting against each other. Then they're united. And then, I mean, they're all the same people of God, yet they can't get along. And it's just, I mean, so we would like to think that in our churches today we could get along, but you know as well as I do how well that works. We have conflict in our churches and everything going on that way as well. But through it all, God is faithful, and God's desire for you and for me is for peace, for life, and for faith and trust in our Lord Jesus Christ.